The island of Guadalcanal lies in the southern Solomon Islands, east of New Guinea and north of Australia. In August 1942, it was a place of dense jungle, heavy rainfall, and limited infrastructure. For the United States, it became the site of its first large-scale offensive against Japanese forces in the Pacific War. The decision to land there was driven by strategic necessity rather than readiness. Japanese engineers had begun constructing an airfield on the island's northern coast, near the Lunga River. If completed and operational, the airfield would threaten Allied supply routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division came ashore on Guadalcanal and the nearby islands of Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The initial landings met lighter resistance than expected, largely because Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal were limited at the time. Within days, the Marines seized the unfinished airfield, later renamed Henderson Field. What followed was not a single battle, but a prolonged campaign fought across land, sea, and air, under conditions for which neither side was fully prepared. At the outset, American planning assumed a relatively short operation. Guadalcanal was expected to be secured quickly, after which the Marines would be relieved and redeployed. Supplies were landed with this assumption in mind. Ammunition, food, medical equipment, construction materials, and spare parts were delivered in limited quantities, reflecting confidence in early success and continued naval support. That confidence would soon be tested. Among the personnel who arrived during the early days of the campaign were officers and enlisted men of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. Though the Marines conducted the ground fighting, logistical support increasingly required coordination across service branches. One such officer was a junior quartermaster captain attached to a naval supply detachment operating from the beachhead near Lunga Point. His responsibilities were not glamorous. He supervised the unloading of supplies, tracked inventory, and attempted to impose order on what was, in practice, a chaotic and exposed supply system. The quartermaster's daily routine began before dawn. Ships anchored offshore during the night to avoid Japanese air attacks, then moved closer to shore at first light. Supplies were transferred by landing craft, often under time pressure, as Japanese aircraft frequently appeared by mid-morning. Cargo was offloaded onto beaches with no docks, then moved inland by hand, vehicle, or improvised rail systems. The terrain made even short distances difficult. Mud, heat, and vegetation slowed every movement. From the quartermaster's vantage point, Guadalcanal presented immediate problems. There were no established storage facilities. Food and ammunition sat exposed to rain and humidity. Packaging designed for temperate climates deteriorated quickly. Metal rusted. Paper rotted. Fuel leaked from containers not meant for tropical conditions. The environment itself became an adversary. Japanese resistance intensified rapidly. Within weeks, naval battles off the island disrupted American supply lines. The loss of several Allied cruisers in the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942 forced U.S. naval commanders to withdraw major surface forces, leaving supply ships vulnerable. Convoys became irregular. Deliveries were delayed or canceled altogether. The Marines ashore were cut off from reliable resupply for extended periods. For the quartermaster and his team, this meant rationing became unavoidable. He recorded shortages of everything from medical dressings to spare vehicle parts. Fresh food was nearly non-existent. Canned goods ran low. Units at the front received what could be spared, often less than what was requested. The quartermaster's reports grew increasingly detailed, documenting not only quantities but conditions: spoiled food, damaged ammunition, and equipment rendered unusable by corrosion or mold. Despite these challenges, official doctrine offered limited guidance. U.S. military logistics planning before the war had focused primarily on European scenarios, where established ports, roads, and rail networks could be assumed. The Pacific theater, with its vast distances and undeveloped islands, presented a fundamentally different problem. On Guadalcanal, there were no manuals for sustaining a prolonged campaign in dense jungle under constant threat of air and naval attack. Communication between frontline units and supply officers was inconsistent. Requests for supplies often arrived late or incomplete. Units relocated frequently to respond to Japanese attacks, making it difficult to establish stable supply routes. Vehicles broke down under harsh conditions, and replacement parts were scarce. Each failure compounded the next. The quartermaster observed these issues not as abstract problems, but as daily realities. He saw Marines weakened by malnutrition and illness. He noted the strain on medical facilities as malaria and dysentery spread. He witnessed the effects of inadequate shelter as prolonged exposure to rain and insects wore down morale. These observations were recorded in logs and reports, forwarded up the chain of command, where they joined similar accounts from other officers across the island. Japanese forces faced their own logistical difficulties, but American personnel were not yet fully aware of the extent of those problems. From the American perspective in late 1942, Guadalcanal appeared to be a tenuous foothold rather than a secure base. Each night, Japanese destroyers ran down the slot to deliver troops and supplies in what became known as the Tokyo Express. Each day, American forces waited to see whether their own supplies would arrive. As the campaign dragged on, it became clear that the initial assumptions underpinning the operation were flawed. Guadalcanal was not a short-term engagement. It was becoming a test of endurance. The quartermaster's workload increased as improvisation replaced planning. Empty crates were repurposed for storage. Tarps became makeshift roofs. Distribution schedules were revised daily based on what could be unloaded and where it could be moved. By September 1942, the gap between official expectations and operational reality had widened. Reports from Guadalcanal described mounting shortages and growing strain. Yet the broader strategic picture demanded persistence. The island could not be abandoned without conceding initiative in the Pacific. Holding Guadalcanal required sustaining forces under conditions that had not been anticipated. For those tasked with logistics, the problem was no longer theoretical. It was immediate and unresolved. The quartermaster understood that without changes in how supplies were delivered, stored, and protected, the situation would deteriorate further. However, authority to alter established procedures was limited. He could document and recommend, but decisions rested elsewhere. As September turned into October, the campaign showed no signs of concluding. Henderson Field remained operational but contested. Naval battles continued offshore. Supplies arrived sporadically, often insufficient for the growing demands of a prolonged fight. The quartermaster's records from this period reflect a shift in tone, from routine accounting to persistent concern. The island had become a proving ground, not only for combat units but for the systems meant to support them. Guadalcanal was exposing the limitations of pre-war planning and the cost of underestimating the environment. The consequences of those limitations were becoming harder to ignore. At this stage, there was no single decision or dramatic moment that marked a turning point. Instead, there was accumulation of shortages, delays, and small failures that together threatened the operation's viability. For the quartermaster and others like him, the question was no longer whether Guadalcanal was important, but whether existing methods were sufficient to sustain it. The campaign continued, unresolved, as the pressure on both men and material increased. By October 1942, the operational situation on Guadalcanal had stabilized only in appearance. The front lines shifted incrementally, but the underlying conditions worsened. Both American and Japanese forces committed additional units to the island, increasing demand on supply systems that were already strained. For American commanders, the challenge was no longer limited to holding ground. It had become a matter of sustaining forces under constant pressure while correcting assumptions that no longer applied. The quartermaster detachment at Lunga Point continued its work amid growing complexity. Ship arrivals were unpredictable. When transports did reach the island, unloading was often interrupted by air attacks, forcing crews to abandon cargo on the beach or return to sea with holds still full. Supplies that did make it ashore accumulated unevenly. Some units received more than they could immediately use, while others went without essentials for days. The lack of secure storage remained unresolved. Efforts were made to construct rudimentary supply dumps inland, but these sites were difficult to conceal and vulnerable to both weather and enemy action. Heavy rains flooded low-lying areas, soaking food and medical supplies. Insects infested packaging. Even ammunition suffered, as moisture affected primers and propellants. Each loss reduced the margin for error. Requests from frontline units became more urgent. Medical officers reported shortages of quinine and other anti-malarial drugs. Engineers asked for tools and spare parts to maintain airstrip operations at Henderson Field. Infantry commanders requested additional rations, boots, and dry clothing. The quartermaster's staff attempted to prioritize, but without consistent resupply, choices were increasingly limited. The quartermaster captain's reports grew longer and more explicit. He noted not only quantities received and distributed, but also the operational consequences of shortages. Vehicles sat idle for lack of parts. Construction projects slowed. Medical treatment was delayed or improvised. These reports were forwarded through naval and army channels, often reaching theater-level commands days or weeks after the conditions described had already changed. At higher levels, doctrine still emphasized offensive momentum and assumed eventual logistical improvement. Official guidance stressed the importance of holding Henderson Field and denying it to the enemy. While this objective was clear, the means to support it were less certain. The quartermaster observed a disconnect between written directives and daily realities on the ground. Japanese pressure intensified during this period. Nighttime artillery bombardments and ground assaults increased, placing additional strain on American defenders. Each engagement consumed ammunition and medical supplies that could not be easily replaced. Japanese aircraft targeted supply areas whenever weather permitted, forcing further dispersion of stockpiles and complicating distribution. The naval situation remained precarious. Surface engagements and air attacks reduced the number of available transports. Losses at sea limited the volume of supplies that could be sent forward. Even when shipping was available, priority was often given to fuel and ammunition, leaving less space for food, construction materials, and medical equipment. The quartermaster's calculations increasingly involved trade-offs rather than solutions. Attempts to adapt were uneven. Some units experimented with local procurement, supplementing rations with captured or foraged food, though this was unreliable and sometimes hazardous. Packaging was modified where possible, using waterproofing materials scavenged from other supplies. Storage practices were adjusted, but without proper facilities, improvements were marginal. Coordination between services presented another challenge. The Marines, Army units, Navy support elements, and Seabees operated under different command structures, each with its own procedures and priorities. While cooperation existed, it was often informal and dependent on personal relationships rather than institutional alignment. The quartermaster captain found himself negotiating daily with officers outside his direct chain of command to secure transport, labor, or storage space. As conditions deteriorated, morale became an increasing concern. Reports from medical officers noted rising cases of exhaustion and illness. The quartermaster observed that shortages affected not only physical readiness but also confidence in the system meant to support the troops. While discipline held, frustration grew as promises of relief or resupply went unmet. Japanese forces faced their own logistical constraints, but American intelligence on those difficulties was limited. From the American perspective, the enemy appeared persistent and capable of reinforcing despite naval losses. This perception reinforced the urgency of maintaining American supply lines, even as those lines remained fragile. In late October, major Japanese ground offensives tested American defenses around Henderson Field. These attacks consumed large quantities of ammunition and medical supplies in a short period. The quartermaster's records from these days show rapid depletion of stockpiles, followed by delays in replenishment. Emergency measures were implemented, including redistribution from rear areas and prioritization of frontline units at the expense of support functions. Official communications continued to emphasize endurance and resolve. Messages from higher command acknowledged difficulties but offered limited practical guidance. The prevailing assumption remained that persistence would eventually be rewarded as additional resources were brought forward. On the ground, however, the pace of consumption often outstripped the pace of delivery. The quartermaster captain began to note patterns rather than isolated incidents. Repeated failures followed similar causes: inadequate protection from weather, insufficient transport capacity, and rigid allocation procedures that did not reflect changing conditions. These patterns suggested systemic issues rather than temporary setbacks. Efforts to raise these concerns encountered resistance. Established doctrine placed responsibility for logistics within defined parameters, leaving little room for deviation without authorization. Suggestions to alter distribution priorities or modify supply compositions required approval through channels that moved slowly, particularly in a combat zone with limited communication infrastructure. As November approached, the campaign showed no sign of resolution. American forces held their positions but at increasing cost. The supply situation remained uncertain, dependent on naval outcomes beyond the control of those ashore. The quartermaster's role became less about maintaining order and more about managing scarcity. The tension between doctrine and reality became more pronounced. Official plans assumed stability that did not exist. Reports from Guadalcanal accumulated, but translating observation into institutional change proved difficult. The quartermaster continued his work, aware that each day's decisions had immediate consequences for units at the front. By this stage, Guadalcanal had revealed itself not merely as a battlefield, but as a test of the American military's ability to adapt under pressure. The systems in place were functioning, but not efficiently or reliably. The cost of that inefficiency was measured in fatigue, illness, and vulnerability. The situation remained unresolved, with no clear indication that existing methods would suffice as the campaign continued into its next phase. By mid-November 1942, the Guadalcanal campaign had entered a phase defined less by maneuver than by endurance. The front lines remained largely unchanged, but the pressure on both forces intensified. For American units, the continued defense of Henderson Field depended not only on repelling Japanese attacks but on maintaining a minimum level of supply under increasingly unstable conditions. The quartermaster captain had been on the island long enough to recognize that the problems he faced were no longer temporary disruptions. They were recurring, predictable, and rooted in assumptions that no longer matched reality. Ship arrivals remained irregular. Storage losses continued. Requests from frontline units exceeded available stocks. Each day required decisions that doctrine had not anticipated. The turning point did not come from a formal order. It emerged gradually, shaped by necessity. The quartermaster began to adjust his approach to supply distribution without waiting for explicit authorization. These adjustments were not dramatic, nor were they openly defiant. They were practical responses to conditions that could no longer be managed within existing guidelines. One of the first changes involved prioritization. Official supply tables allocated resources based on unit strength and standard consumption rates. On Guadalcanal, those rates were inaccurate. Units engaged in frequent night fighting consumed ammunition at unpredictable levels. Medical units treating malaria and dysentery required supplies not emphasized in standard planning. The quartermaster began reallocating shipments based on observed need rather than prescribed formulas. This meant some units received less than their authorized share, while others received more. These decisions carried risk. Any deviation from established procedure exposed the quartermaster to potential criticism or disciplinary action. However, the alternative was continued mismatch between supply and demand, with immediate consequences for combat effectiveness. Storage practices were also modified. Rather than concentrating supplies in larger dumps, which were vulnerable to weather and air attack, the quartermaster directed the dispersal of critical items into smaller, concealed caches closer to the front. This increased the labor required to manage inventory and complicated record-keeping, but it reduced losses from single incidents and improved access during emergencies. Coordination with other units became more informal. The quartermaster worked directly with CB detachments to identify sheltered areas suitable for storage. He negotiated with naval officers for limited use of landing craft to move supplies at unconventional hours, including after dusk, despite increased risk. These arrangements were often made through personal contact rather than written orders. The most significant adjustment involved acceptance of loss as a planning factor. Previous reports had treated spoilage and damage as exceptions. The quartermaster began incorporating expected losses into his calculations, requesting additional quantities when possible and redistributing supplies preemptively. This approach acknowledged the environment as an unavoidable variable rather than a temporary inconvenience. These changes were not coordinated across the island. Other supply officers made similar adjustments independently, each responding to local conditions. There was no unified directive authorizing such flexibility. Instead, adaptation occurred unevenly, driven by individual judgment. The quartermaster's decisions became increasingly personal as their consequences became clearer. When supplies failed to reach a unit in time, casualties followed. When adjustments succeeded, units reported improved readiness, even if only marginally. Each outcome reinforced the necessity of continued deviation from established procedures. Japanese actions continued to shape the situation. Naval engagements in mid-November disrupted Japanese resupply efforts, reducing the scale of ground attacks. However, American supply lines remained vulnerable, and the reduction in Japanese pressure did not translate into immediate logistical relief. The quartermaster noted that even temporary advantages required sustained support to be meaningful. Communication with higher command remained limited. Reports continued to move slowly, and responses were often general in nature. While theater-level commanders recognized logistical difficulties, translating that recognition into revised doctrine or procedures lagged behind events. The quartermaster understood that institutional change would come, if at all, after the immediate crisis had passed. In the meantime, improvisation became routine. Damaged supplies were repaired or repackaged where possible, and used equipment was cannibalized for parts. Units shared resources informally, bypassing official channels to address urgent needs. These practices blurred the lines of responsibility but kept the system functioning. The quartermaster maintained detailed records of these adjustments, not as justification, but as reference. He noted which changes reduced losses, which improved delivery times, and which introduced new problems. These records were not intended as policy proposals, but as practical documentation of what worked under specific conditions. By late November, the cumulative effect of these unofficial adjustments became visible. While shortages persisted, distribution became more responsive. Units reported fewer critical gaps, even if overall supply levels remained low. The system was still fragile, but it had become more flexible. This flexibility came at a cost. The quartermaster worked longer hours, and his staff faced increased strain. Decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information. The margin for error narrowed. Each choice carried potential consequences for both operational effectiveness and professional standing. The risk was not theoretical. Deviating from doctrine without authorization could result in formal reprimand or worse, particularly if outcomes were unfavorable. The quartermaster was aware of this, but the immediate needs of the campaign outweighed distant administrative concerns. As November ended, it became clear that Guadalcanal was forcing adaptation at levels below formal command. The changes underway were not yet recognized as doctrine, but they reflected an emerging understanding of how war in the Pacific differed from previous assumptions. The quartermaster's role had evolved from managing supplies to managing uncertainty. His decisions, shaped by observation and necessity, represented a quiet shift in how the campaign was sustained. Whether these changes would be acknowledged, resisted, or institutionalized remained uncertain. For now, the focus remained on maintaining enough cohesion and capability to continue holding the island. The campaign was not yet resolved, but the nature of the struggle had changed. Adaptation, rather than adherence, had become the defining factor in sustaining the fight. By December 1942, the operational environment on Guadalcanal had shifted again. Japanese ground attacks diminished in frequency and scale, reflecting mounting difficulties in their own supply system. However, for American forces, the easing of pressure did not translate into immediate relief. The logistical structure supporting the island remained fragile, and the unofficial adaptations that had kept it functioning now drew increasing scrutiny. As supply flows slowly improved, higher headquarters began to reassert procedural control. Inspections increased. Requests for standardized reporting returned. Officers arriving from outside the island brought expectations shaped by doctrine rather than experience. The quartermaster captain found that practices once tolerated out of necessity were now questioned. Some of the adjustments he had implemented conflicted with established regulations. Redistribution of supplies outside authorized tables raised concerns about accountability. Dispersed storage complicated inventory verification. Informal coordination across service lines blurred command boundaries. While these measures had reduced losses and improved responsiveness, they did not align neatly with formal expectations. The quartermaster was required to justify his decisions through written explanations and revised reports. He documented the conditions under which those decisions had been made, emphasizing environmental factors and operational constraints. These explanations were factual and restrained, but they highlighted a gap between doctrine and practice that was uncomfortable for some reviewers. Pushback did not come as direct punishment, but as pressure to return to standard procedures. There was an implicit assumption that the worst of the crisis had passed and that normal systems could be restored. The quartermaster recognized the risk in this assumption. Many of the underlying conditions, terrain, climate, distance, remained unchanged. At the same time, the consequences of earlier shortages were still visible. Medical units continued to treat long-term illness. Equipment degraded during the height of the campaign required replacement or repair. Infrastructure built hastily under fire needed reinforcement. The supply system was no longer in immediate collapse, but it was far from robust. The quartermaster's position became increasingly difficult. Continuing unofficial practices risked administrative repercussions. Reverting fully to doctrine risked renewed inefficiency and loss. Each decision now involved balancing operational effectiveness against institutional expectations. These tensions reflected a broader issue within the American military at that stage of the war. Guadalcanal had exposed weaknesses in planning and coordination that could not be fully addressed through temporary measures. Yet formal recognition of those weaknesses lagged behind operational reality. The system was slow to absorb lessons learned under pressure. Some changes did occur. Requests from Guadalcanal began to influence supply planning at higher levels. Shipping priorities were adjusted incrementally. Additional engineering and support units were assigned. These responses suggested growing acknowledgement of the campaign's demands, but they did not immediately resolve structural problems. The quartermaster continued to operate within this uncertain space. He complied with new reporting requirements while preserving, where possible, the adaptations that had proven effective. Dispersed storage remained in use, though more carefully documented. Prioritization based on observed need continued, framed now as temporary adjustments rather than permanent deviations. The stakes of these decisions remained high. While Japanese forces were withdrawing from some positions, the campaign was not yet officially concluded. Any lapse in supply could still have serious consequences. The quartermaster's awareness of this sustained a cautious approach, even as pressure to normalize procedures increased. By early January 1943, the Japanese decision to evacuate Guadalcanal was not yet fully apparent to American forces on the ground. Preparations continued under the assumption that resistance might intensify again. Supplies were accumulated where possible, and contingency plans remained in place. The quartermaster's records from this period show a gradual shift in tone. Urgency gave way to guarded stability. The immediate crisis had passed, but its effects lingered. The experience had demonstrated the limits of pre-war planning and the necessity of adaptation, even if formal acknowledgement of those lessons remained incomplete. As the campaign approached its conclusion, the quartermaster understood that his actions would likely be absorbed into the larger administrative record without individual recognition. The system would credit success to broader command decisions and material superiority. The smaller adjustments, made quietly under pressure, would remain largely invisible. Yet those adjustments had sustained the campaign through its most vulnerable phase. The challenge now was whether the institution would retain what had been learned or revert fully to familiar procedures once the crisis ended. The resolution of that question lay beyond the island itself. In February 1943, organized Japanese resistance on Guadalcanal came to an end. Through a series of nighttime evacuations, Japanese forces withdrew the remaining troops who could be saved. American commanders did not immediately recognize the scale of the evacuation, but by mid-month it was clear that the campaign had concluded. Guadalcanal was secured. For the units that remained on the island, the transition from combat operations to consolidation was gradual. Supply systems expanded and stabilized. Permanent storage facilities replaced improvised dumps. Roads and ports were improved. The conditions that had forced improvisation did not disappear, but the margin for error widened as shipping increased and the tempo of combat declined. The quartermaster captain continued his duties through this transition. His work shifted from crisis management to reconstruction and accounting. Inventories were reconciled. Losses were documented. Equipment damaged during the campaign was surveyed for repair or replacement. Reports that had once described shortages and improvisation now focused on restoration and standardization. At higher levels, Guadalcanal began to be assessed as a completed operation. After-action reports emphasized command decisions, naval engagements, and combat performance. Logistics appeared in these documents, but often as background rather than as a central factor. The difficulties encountered were acknowledged, but frequently framed as the inevitable friction of war rather than as indicators of systemic weakness. Nevertheless, the institutional response unfolded quietly. Lessons from Guadalcanal were incorporated into planning for subsequent Pacific operations. Supply tables were revised to account for tropical conditions. Packaging standards improved. Greater emphasis was placed on engineering support, storage, and redundancy. Coordination between services, while still imperfect, received increased attention. These changes were incremental rather than dramatic. There was no single directive that cited Guadalcanal as a turning point. Instead, its influence appeared in updated manuals, revised procedures, and altered assumptions about what sustaining combat in the Pacific required. The experience reshaped expectations, even if it did not immediately reshape narratives. For the quartermaster captain, the end of the campaign did not bring recognition beyond routine evaluations. His unofficial adjustments were neither formally endorsed nor explicitly criticized. They became part of the operational record without attribution. Like many support officers, his contribution was absorbed into the larger system. After Guadalcanal, he would be reassigned, carrying with him practical knowledge gained under pressure. That knowledge, shared informally with others, contributed to a growing body of experience that shaped later campaigns. The systems that supported operations in the Central and Western Pacific bore traces of lessons learned on Guadalcanal, even when those lessons were not openly acknowledged. Guadalcanal's significance did not lie solely in territory gained or enemy forces defeated. It lay in the exposure of assumptions that could not hold in the Pacific environment. The campaign revealed that endurance depended on systems as much as on strategy, and that adaptation often occurred first at the margins, driven by necessity rather than policy. The battle is remembered for its ships sunk, aircraft lost, and soldiers killed. Less visible are the adjustments made by those tasked with sustaining the fight under conditions no plan had fully anticipated. Their work did not produce decisive moments, but it made endurance possible. Guadalcanal became important not because it was perfectly executed, but because it forced recognition of reality. The campaign showed what modern war in the Pacific demanded and what it cost when preparation fell short. That recognition shaped what followed.